למען ציון לא אחשה, ולמען ירושלים לא אשקוט.
You are listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.
Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon with Hebrew Voices, and we are back today with Dr. Miryam Brand, who has a PhD from New York University. We did an earlier episode with her on the origin of sin, looking at the concept of where sin comes from in Second Temple Jewish literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other stuff. And it was one of the most popular episodes that I've ever done, and for the Hebrew Voices, it actually is the most popular episode so far. And we decided to do another episode, and today we're talking about the Book of Enoch. Shalom, Dr. Brand.
Shalom. It's nice to be here.
It really is exciting to be here. And the Book of Enoch, so, that's part of what is called the Pseudepigrapha, right?
Right.
Meaning you've got, for the Tanakh, for the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, you've got the actual 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. In Hebrew, they're counted as 24 books. And you've got what is sometimes called the Apocrypha. If we have time, we'll talk about that, or maybe do a whole series of episodes. Or we'll, and then in addition, you have something called the Pseudepigrapha, which is even part of the Apocrypha. Enoch is part of the Pseudepigrapha. But interestingly, it's a relatively early book. When was Enoch written? Was it written by Enoch?
Who is
Enoch? Let's back up for that.
Okay, all right. So if you look at Genesis 5, that's where you'll learn about who Enoch was, right?
Okay.
Enoch is...
That's homework, Genesis 5.
Yeah. So I can just read you a translation of the verses I have in front of me. So when Enoch had lived 65 years, he begot Methuselah. After the birth of Methuselah, Enoch, or Chanoch in Hebrew, walked with God 300 years. Now, the word used for God there is Elohim. And that's important, so just remember that. And he begot sons and daughters. All the days of Enoch came to 365 years. Enoch walked with God, Elohim, then he was no more, for God, Elohim, took him. Now, I'm using, that traditionally Jews frequently won't say that word. They'll say Elohim to mean God, but if you're using Elohim to mean angels, you just say Elohim. And certainly in the Second Temple
So the word
period,
Elohim, just to be clear, can mean God, right. And it can mean judges. For example, in Exodus, it talks about Asher Yalshun Elohim, who the judges convict.
Right. So traditionally that verse has been translated as judges. If you ask an academic, they won't translate it as judges. They'll actually translate, well, God is going to, you're going to get some sign from God saying who is going to convict him. But traditionally, that's actually very interesting because the traditional interpretation of that verse as judges has influenced what we're going to probably talk about later.
And by the way, the reason
of the watchers. So,
the reason it's traditionally, I think, interpreted as judges is it's Yalshi'un, it's plural.
Yeah.
It's literally who they, the Elohim, convict.
Right.
And so it's understood, well, that can't be God because God would be Ashil Yalshia.
And it certainly wouldn't be angels because how can angels convict?
Right.
That's,
unless you have some kind of angelic court. I don't know.
Right.
And what you're saying is, in a sense, you wear two hats here. You wear the hat of the academic from New York University, but also as an Orthodox Jew, there's a category that you're aware of, even though that's not, today you're actually here as an academic, right?
Right.
Okay.
But it is important to keep in mind, and it's good for me to always remember the traditional interpretation and the academic interpretation. And frequently I will say, well, the rabbinic interpretation is this, or when I'm speaking kind of rabbinic, I'll say the academic interpretation, recognize that an academic.
And that traditional interpretation, what you're saying, it influenced the interpretation of this verses in Genesis. So,
well, the fact that we have the verse in Exodus where Elohim seems to mean judges, right, from a traditional point of view, means that you can translate Elohim as judges. Okay. So that doesn't influence the
so what do we have here in
Enoch? Let's go back to Enoch.
Yeah.
So what we have here in Enoch is Enoch.
And this isn't the book of Enoch. This is Genesis chapter 5. Yeah. We're still in the Tanakh.
Yes, we're still in the Torah. So Enoch is walking with God, right? That's the way you would normally understand it. But in the Second Temple period, they're already thinking very much in terms of angels. And who can walk with God? You can't walk with God. He must be walking with angels, right?
Wow.
He's walking with angels. And the angels took him. So then the question is, well, there are a bunch of questions. This is a period when people are really wondering what's up there in terms of the heavens. People really thinking about angels, thinking about the mysteries of the universe, and particularly heavenly mysteries really interest them. So one of the things that they're wondering is what's up there. And then another thing they're wondering is why was Enoch taken. And there are a lot of places in...
And do we know that he was actually taken? Meaning when you read the Hebrew literally, I mean, it says, "V'enenu," and he was no more.
But it says, for God took him, yeah. For lakachoto Elohim.
Does that, so in other words, look, when I read it and I'm trying to look at the pshat, the plain meaning, as a, I'm coming as the Karaite reading it, and I say, yeah, he took him like everybody dies. He was, taken.
Okay, right.
But in other words, it's an unusual way of saying somebody died, and it's very reminiscent, and it could be very reminiscent of how Elijah was taken up by a chariot of fire.
Exactly.
So, all right.
Yeah. So it's
and
very
that's not
easy to interpret that as, at the very least, he was taken alive, or not quite, that he didn't die in a normal way.
Even though you really could read it and say he just died.
Exactly.
But it doesn't say died, it said he was taken by God, so maybe he was taken up into heaven alive. Okay, so...
Right. So you can very easily read it just as he died, and he was a very special person, and that's why it just talks about him this way.
Okay.
Because someone who walked with God, what does that even mean?
Right.
Right?
And you're saying walked with God might mean he walked with the angels.
Well, I'm saying that that's the way they interpreted it in the Second Temple period. I don't want to say... I think that he walked with angels. I think that in the verse, it makes more sense that there's some kind of, to walk with God, there, you could say, well, what does walking with God mean? And we have a lot of interpretations, different possible interpretations of that. You simply say he was just very, very righteous, and that's what it means. And yet he still died because God took him.
But what you're saying is, based on their understanding of the nature of God in the Second Temple period, they said, well, you can't walk with God. So obviously her Elohim means angels, and there's the verse in Psalms,
and then you have B'nai Elohim in chapter 6, just one chapter later.
We'll get to that.
Right, we're going to get to that, but those are clearly angels. Okay. So from their point of view, and frankly, that's the easiest interpretation, that those are angels. So it's very easy for them to kind of jump to, this is also angels.
So he walked with angels was the interpretation. That then,
seems to have been the interpretation.
Okay, and then how does that lead to the book of Enoch?
Okay, so here you have, the book of Enoch is really several books. It's really about 5 books, maybe 6 if you count the last chapter as a separate book, which, by the way, themselves are kind of built up of different pieces. But those books each have a different point. The only thing they have in common is Enoch as a character. And that's pretty much the only thing they have in common. However, what we're going to be focusing on today, which is the Book of the Watchers, that really addresses why was Enoch taken? What was going on? Why did Enoch have to go up to heaven? Why was he hanging out with angels? And the answer that the Book of the Watchers presents is that you had this sin of the Watchers that we're going to talk about in a little while. Yeah. And he was asked by the Watchers to defend them, actually. And God's like,
which
no,
is an incredible
tell
concept. A human is praying for angels. Let's hold on to that. But so just for those who think like, wow, how crazy is this? That somebody in Second Temple times read this verse in Genesis 5 and said he walked with Elohim, he walked with God. It means he walked with angels. Yeah. So in Psalm chapter 8, verse 6, and in the English it's verse 5. It says it's talking about mankind. It says Elohim, you have made him a little lower than God in the NRSV. New Revised Standard Version, but then the King James Version says, for thou hast made him a little lower than the angels.
Right.
And those are both valid interpretations.
Yes, absolutely. In that case, absolutely.
So the point is that Elohim can legitimately be translated as angels. Whether it means angels in Genesis 5, that's a matter of interpretation. But somebody interpreted it that way, that Enoch was walking with the angels, and that led to this, I guess, creative burst in the Second Temple period where somebody wanted to write, okay, he walked with the angels. What did that look like? Yeah. Right? Okay. So that brings us to the book of Enoch. Right. And you said there's 5 books. Right. So, and of those 5 books, meaning Enoch's a pretty long, and let's be clear, there's 1 Enoch, and there's 2 Enoch, and there's 3. We're only talking about 1 Enoch. Yeah. Within one First Enoch, there are 5 different books that have been crunched together into a single book. And then 4 of those books were found at Qumran. Tell us about that.
Okay, so all the books except for what's considered the most unusual of the books, which is the Parables of Enoch. It's also called the Similitudes of Enoch. And that book, it uses different terminology, uses different words, standard words than the other books. It also talks about the Son of Man or the Chosen One. And it's unusual because in many Second Temple works, there really actually isn't much of an emphasis on a specific Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
There's much more of an emphasis on a messianic age, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where there's going to be this
I
big
think
battle.
in Judaism in general, that's the emphasis on the messianic age versus the Messiah. Am I wrong?
As rabbinic Judaism kind of develops, and you go into the Middle Ages in particular, the Messiah becomes more and more prominent.
Okay.
But it's absolutely true that there's a lot of...
I think even today, I'll often hear people talk about Yemei Mashiach.
Right.
And the actual, the days of the Messiah.
Right.
And the actual character of the Messiah. He's important, but it's more like, okay, so what do we get out of that in the days? But you're saying like in Second Temple period, it was even less significant, except in this book of parables, which doesn't appear.
It does appear a little bit in another book of another section of Enoch where you have a Messiah, and particularly what's called the animal apocalypse, which is part of, if I remember correctly, the apocalypse of weeks, where there is kind of a messianic.
Okay, we're probably not going to get to that.
Yeah, sorry.
So all right, so yeah, go on.
If we're talking about, so there's this one book which is unusual. It talks about the Son of Man. It talks about the chosen one being this messianic figure.
Yeah.
And it's the one book that there's no fragment of it found at Qumran. So the natural assumption is, this is a Christian book. It's not actually a Jewish book. Right. However, it doesn't have particularly Christian terminology. And the big revelation at the end of that book is that Enoch is the Son of Man.
Whoa.
Yes, it's Enoch. And they say, you, Enoch, you are the Son of Man. You are the messianic figure.
So let's just be clear. When you open up 1 Enoch and you read it, it doesn't say 1 Enoch, book 1, 1 Enoch, book 2.
No.
And by the way, I need to remind people that, you wrote a book called Evil Within and Without. We talked about that in the last episode, Origin of Sin, the last episode with you. And then you also wrote a commentary on the book of Enoch, which is part of a larger collection of a series called Outside the Bible.
Yeah.
And, it's funny, you told me when we first talked about this, you wrote a chapter, and then we looked it up, and it was like, you wrote over 90 pages. That's your quote-unquote chapter. And it's like a systematic commentary on Enoch, on 1 Enoch, on the first book of Enoch. And so we're going to have a link on nehemiaswall.com referring people to Outside the Bible, where they can get your commentary on Enoch, because we're not going to be able to talk about all this. But the other thing I really want to refer people to, because when we were discussing this beforehand, I said we could do a whole series on this. And then I found out you're doing your own podcast, and it's going to be called understandingsin.com. That's the website, understandingsin.com. And I'm going to hope and pray that you do a series just on the book of Enoch, and people can hear more about it, because there's just so much to talk about here. We're just going to scratch the surface. This is so exciting, this stuff. And just, so this book of parables, for a lot of people who come from a New Testament perspective is really important, because it has this term Son of Man referring to a Messiah. It has all kinds of concepts about the Messiah being, let's be honest, far more important than traditional Judaism has understood him to be, and certainly more than the Tanakh Judaism understood him to be, as it's understood by traditional Judaism. And, he's this almost supernatural figure. And maybe not almost, isn't he a supernatural figure in the book of parables?
He has a very, very important role.
And what you're saying is, of the 5 sections of Enoch and this is as identified by scholars, the 5 different books of Enoch within First Enoch, the second one, this most important one for the Christian and New Testament audience, actually isn't in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and some people suspect it of being a later composition. But what you're pointing out means it couldn't be Christian. Meaning, if Enoch is identified as the Son of Man, how could that be Christian?
That's why, and works that we see where we can tell that Christians have kind of edited them. Like, for example, the Testaments of the Patriarchs, which is, there's a whole argument about, can we only treat this as a Christian work? Can we look at the Jewish sources without the Christian additions? But it's very clear when they're putting in Christian additions.
Right. And what comes to mind is, and by the way, let's give some context here. So this document, First Enoch, wasn't preserved by Jews, right? Meaning, where do we have it from?
Okay. So first, I just want to make clear also that, just like as I said, that First Enoch is really a whole bunch of books. They're actually from different time periods. So the Parables of Enoch are actually dated to between 40 before the Common Era, and before 70 to the Common Era. In other words, it's after the Parthian invasion in 40 BCE. And before the destruction of the Second Temple.
So sometime between what's commonly known 40 BC to 70 AD.
Right, which on the one
is when it was written.
is when it was written. It's very
Okay,
important
because I've read people who claimed it was written as early as the 4th century or 3rd century
that's the
BC.
whole book. That's the entire book of Enoch. You understand what I'm saying? If they're saying what's the earliest piece of the book of Enoch, that's why I thought it was important to point that out.
So in other words, this
when
book,
we look at dates,
the first portion may have been written as early as, and I'm throwing out a number, 350 BC.
Yeah, let's say,
and the last section was written as late as 70 AD.
Yes.
Okay,
and that last section is this one that has all the Son of Man,
the really interesting stuff for the Christian audience.
Well, and there's a reason, because if you're thinking about Christianity coming from Judaism, they're coming from Judaism of exactly that period. This book is being written precisely, if in fact it's accurate, to date this work to between 40 BCE and 70 CE, then we can talk about it as coming from the same period, more or less, from when what we call the Jesus movement, early Christianity.
Okay.
So, in other words, you've got these concepts floating around in Judaism at just the time when the Jesus movement is kind of starting.
In other words, when in the New Testament it refers to Jesus or Yeshua as the Son of Man, what you're saying is that's not a term that was invented by the people who believed in Jesus. It was a term that those Jews who came to believe in Jesus already knew from the book of Parables and maybe other literature we don't have. And so, they were looking for the Son of Man, and some of them found him.
Yeah, so I think that at least it's something to consider.
Okay.
That this was already a term that was being used in a wider range of Jews. Now, of course, remember that Son of Man is a very prominent term in the book of Ezekiel.
Right, so it actually does appear in Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel, it just means like human being or mortal.
But he keeps on calling the prophet Son of Man. He keeps on calling Ezekiel Son of Man.
But if I understand correctly, in the context of Ezekiel, here is this...
It just means human being, right?
Right, well, it's God who's speaking to Ezekiel, essentially in a way speaking down to Ezekiel. In other words, you're immortal, I'm this, infinite being, I'm the creator of the universe, and you're a Ben Adam, you're son of Adam, son of man. But then the fact that the prophet is then always called Son of Man in Ezekiel, then what you're saying is in the book of Parables, which is the second section of 1 Enoch, or 1st Enoch, then became this term for this elevated figure.
Right. In other words, you've got this, particularly when people are reading it in translation.
Yeah.
I think, like the same way when we say Son of Man, it sounds really important.
Well,
right?
and also there's a capital S and a capital M.
Right.
Whereas in Hebrew, there's no capital letters, right?
Right.
So it literally is Ben Adam, son of Adam, is. And like I think in the JPS, if I'm not mistaken, they translated it as "O mortal," whatever he says. Ben Adam.
which is a good translation
in
because
Ezekiel.
that's what in Ezekiel because that's what it means.
But in Enoch, it wouldn't be a good translation.
Right. And if you're reading, if you happen to read a translation where it's being really, really literal, then it sounds like something important.
Okay.
So
and again, it is important in the book of Parables, which maybe we'll do an episode on one day. I want to bring up 2 issues. First is. And this episode might just be the introduction to Enoch. I think we're going to end up doing a second episode just on the Book of the Watchers, which is the first section of 1 Enoch. So, and by the way, people, like I said, Miryam, Dr. Brand, she has a new podcast, which what I'm going to call on everybody to do, go to understandingsin.com and find her podcast, and then find it on iTunes and subscribe to it. So every time she comes out with an episode, it automatically downloads to your iPhone or your Android.
Yes, that would be great.
That's what you really need to do, because this is some great stuff. I'm going to be listening to her podcast. This is some really good stuff. But I want to talk really, really briefly as possible about the Epistle of Jude, which is in the New Testament. And the reason I'm going to read you from Jude, there's only one chapter in Jude. From Jude chapter 1, verse 14. And it said, "Now Enoch, the 7th in descent, beginning with Adam, even prophesied of them, saying, Look, the Lord is coming with thousands and thousands of his holy ones." And in verse 15, "to execute judgment on all, and to convict every person of all their thoroughly ungodly deeds that they have committed, and of all the harsh words that ungodly sinners have spoken against him." And that's the end of the quote. And so it's 2 verses in the Epistle of Jude. And the reason I bring this up is it's quoting Enoch as a prophet. And those 2 exact verses actually appear in 1 Enoch, right?
Yes. And
actually the first chapter of 1 Enoch.
Yes.
Meaning Jude didn't read very far, I guess, to get to this. What's interesting to me, so does that mean, and I don't know if either of us is qualified to talk about this, it might be a theological question for Christians to talk about. But as a scholar, does that mean that the author of the Epistle of Jude considered 1 Enoch, or at least, let's say, the first 36 chapters of 1 Enoch, which is its own book, did he consider that part of his Bible?
I would say that he at the very least considered what we considered authoritative. In other words, he considered this an authoritative source. This is something that is, has authority. Did he consider it a basic part of his canon. The truth is, I mean, the church fathers knew First Enoch. They
and define church fathers. That's really meaning it's almost like when we say Chazal, which is a very technical term. So church fathers is the Christian authors from really the first 400 or 500 years of the Christian church.
Yeah. So at a certain point, and that's why we have, for example, the Book of the Watchers. We have a nice large piece of it still that was transmitted in Greek, that was kept in Greek. We still have.
So the main text of Enoch actually comes from Ethiopic, from the Ethiopian
what we
church.
have now. The Ethiopian church kept two unusual books really within their canon, and that's First Enoch and Jubilees. And thanks to the Ethiopian church, we have full copies of these works.
So let's go over this. This is where so much to talk about. So First Enoch exists in whole only in Ethiopic, and I was looking at in your commentary, the manuscripts are really late. Like the manuscripts are like the 16th century and later.
Yes, but I will, and also there hasn't been a real critical edition. In other words, there's been a critical edition.
I don't know if my listeners know what a critical edition is.
Okay, a critical edition is when you take all the manuscripts of something and you actually compare them. And you might choose, let's say, one text which you think is the best, and then have footnotes for all the differences. Then every scholar can, by opening this one work, see what the different manuscript evidence is.
So this is really amazing. What you're saying is we don't necessarily really even know what the final text what the real text.
So someone is working on this right now.
Okay.
Right now, this is what I wanted to say. Lawrence Stuckenbrook, who's he's a professor who specializes in Enoch, among other things. He's amazing because he is actually traveling. He spent a lot of time in Ethiopia. He actually spent some time even in Eritrea, tracking down these manuscripts.
Wow.
Now realize that once it's part of your canon, every Bible's got it, right?
Right. Hey, whoa. Back up. So the Book of 1 Enoch isn't part of the Jewish Bible.
Right.
It's not part of the standard Christian Bible, but the Ethiopian Orthodox Church actually includes it in their Bible.
Right. So you have lots.
They don't just have copies of it; it's in their Bible.
It's in their Bible. I mean, if every single Bible has it, that I don't know, because I have not traveled Ethiopia.
But it's officially in their Bible as far as the Western world understands.
In other words, we would consider it's part of their canon. So he's sitting in their library looking at huge numbers of manuscripts and actually comparing them to create a real critical edition.
So we have the Ethiopian version, which is actually a Semitic language called Ge'ez.
Right.
So it's in the Ge'ez Ethiopian version, which is the complete 1 Enoch. And then you have fragments in Greek.
Right.
What other fragments do you have?
Well, we have some fragments that come from Qumran. Those are in Aramaic.
Okay.
So we can pretty much...
And we possibly have some really, really small fragments in Hebrew. That's my understanding. I think that's controversial.
That's in general, it's considered to be originally in Aramaic.
Okay.
Originally Aramaic, and then it was translated into Greek, and from Greek translated into Ethiopic.
That's really interesting.
Yes.
So, it's
and there's certain books that there's for example, the astronomical book of Enoch, which has all sorts of observations about the moon that are moon and sun. They are very confusing with lots of numbers.
And maybe some of that was lost in translation.
So a lot of that, a lot of that got. We actually found an Aramaic version at Qumran that's very different from the Ethiopian version that came down.
So I want to dwell on this just for a second. So this is really interesting. You have a book that's preserved from a very late period in Ethiopian manuscripts in a Semitic language in Ge'ez. And those are, as far as I understand, the earliest ones are in the 16th century. Maybe they're earlier ones now that this guy has discovered. And that's a translation from a Greek text of which we only have fragments. And that itself is a translation from another Semitic language from an Aramaic text of which we have even smaller fragments. And some of these fragments are like, a few letters. Tiny. But it's enough to know that we're dealing with a version of Enoch. And so it's interesting because if you only had the Ethiopian, you might say, oh, well, this is some late book that was written by the Christians. And you might, I don't know. And, but now it's proven that it actually existed in the Second Temple period from the Qumran finds from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right, and Qumran finds did that for that and for Jubilees, even though there are, and with Enoch it was a real question, because Enoch, even though it clearly reflects certain understandings of Bible verses, it doesn't talk that much about, let's say, keeping Torah law. Okay, So that sort of Enoch.
So you're suspected of being Christian. It's obsessed with interpreting there's nothing against Christians, but the church was much more interested in how do we interpret these verses than how do we keep the Torah. And you're saying Jewish works tend to be talking about how do we keep this commandment and that commandment,
right? Except that we have
like
to
the Damascus document at Qumran.
Well, we have to remember also there's a whole wisdom literature that is more about just kind of general moral things as opposed to saying how do you keep X commandment. So we can connect Enoch. We can connect Enoch to the interpretation, traditions of interpretation, and the wisdom. Wisdom.
All right, I want to go back real quick to Jude. So this may have been considered authoritative by the author of the Epistle of Jude, but even then, we probably were only talking about this chapters 1 through 36, which is the book of the book of Watchers, which we're going to talk about in the next episode, which we'll probably record in a few minutes, but you guys will be hearing it weeks later. Because we're almost running out of time. So it was in Jude. So I just want to, I'll tell you how I look at this, and this is me and my pet theory. It's not a pet theory. I'm pretty sure I'm right. So there's a book called For Ezra, which is part of something called the Ezra Chitzoni, the Ezra Apocalypse, which isn't in the Bible, but I'm convinced this is literature from the Second Temple period or shortly thereafter. And for Ezra, chapter 14, verses 45 to 46, it describes something that supposedly Ezra did, but I don't think Ezra did it. It's something they believed he did. It says, and when the 40 days were ended, the Most High spoke to me, meaning to Ezra, saying, quote, make public the 24 books that you wrote first, and let the worthy and the unworthy read them. Verse 46, but keep the 70 that were written last in order to give them to the wise among your people. For in them is the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the river of knowledge. And I did so. So here it's describing really two canons of the Old Testament. And canon is like which books are included. So it's the 24 books that are made public for the entire nation of Israel. And I think no one will dispute that that's what we call the Tanakh today, the Hebrew Bible, because we actually count them as 24 books, even though the Christians count them differently. In English, they're counted as 1 Kings and 2 Kings. In Hebrew, it's just the book of Melachim. But then he talks about these 70 books that are these secret books only for the initiated. And I've always understood this to refer to something like the Essenes, and whether we call them Essenes or not, that's a discussion, but some kind of group of Jews who had more books that weren't known to the other Jews or weren't accessible to the other Jews, and they attributed those books to Ezra. And so what's your take on that?
Okay, so I think that absolutely there are a lot of books that kind of had the cachet of being secret books. These are special books. The book of Jubilees refers to itself essentially as the other book that Moses got at Sinai, right?
That's interesting. Yeah. It reminds me of the Book of Mormon, who's like the other New Testament of Jesus Christ or whatever. So in other words, Jubilees is presenting itself as an angel speaking to Moses at Mount Sinai.
Right.
Meaning when we read a lot of the Midrash, which is, rabbinical literature, it often will be in the name of this rabbi and that rabbi. And here it's actually presenting itself as an angel speaking to Moses.
That's a basic difference in the way interpretation is presented in the Second Temple period and the way we have in the rabbinic tradition. So, for example, what you'll have in a lot of Second Temple interpretation is they simply retell, we call it a rewritten Bible. They'll retell the story of the Bible with the interpretation kind of baked in, right?
With some tweaks.
Okay. So for example, you have the Genesis Apocryphon, which is in Aramaic, and it's retelling a biblical story. And we have that verse where the people tell Pharaoh how beautiful Sarai is, because and then that's when he takes her, right? His advisors tell him how beautiful she is. And in the Genesis Apocryphon, it actually adds a poem. There's a whole poem that they say about how beautiful she is, going into detail. And that sort of thing was kind of just put right into the retelling of the story. Right. Whereas in rabbinic interpretation, you'll have a quote of the verse, and what Rabbi says, there's a real distinction between this is the original and this is the interpretation.
And you do have that at Qumran in the form of the Pesher.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. But then there's a second genre, so you've got the Pesher where it says, here's the verse, and its interpretation is, but then you have this genre, this type of writing where they actually, as you say, bake it into they've rewritten the Bible with the interpretation baked in. That's fascinating.
But coming back to this idea of the canon and this idea of secret works. So if you think about what the word apocrypha means, the word apocrypha actually means hidden things, which is a strange word to use for books that actually were not hidden for the Alexandrian Jews. And so there's this idea that there are these books that are hidden, and I would say it's far bigger than the Qumran group. There are a lot of people that are reading these groups, but they're kind of look, they're literate, clearly. They're people who are a little bit more educated, and they're people who like to think about the mysteries of what's going on. They're the ones who are writing and reading these books. So, for example, in Enoch itself, in the book of Enoch, if at the very end, it talks about saying, let's see, I'm reading chapter 104, verse 10. And now I know this mystery, that many sinners will alter and distort the words of truth and speak evil words and lie and concoct great fabrications and write books in their own words. In other words, there are going to be people who don't be fooled. There are going to be people who write fake books, says the author of
a fake book.
Yes.
Wait. So let's just be clear. Scholars agree. And look, you can, say scholars are wrong. That's your theological belief. Whatever your belief is out there, work that out for yourself. But certainly scholars, and even Christian scholars and secular scholars and Jewish scholars, Enoch didn't write these books.
No.
Right. And so basically this guy's pretending to be Enoch or writing in Enoch's name. Some people say he's doing it to honor them. Other people would say that's a forgery.
Right.
Like Bart Ehrman has this amazing book called Forged. I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but he makes some good points. So he's writing this book pretending to be Enoch and saying, "Watch out! Other people are going to write book and
write fake books, right?
Write books pretending they're someone they're not."
Yes,
and he's actually doing that.
That's right.
So is he doing that to kind of cover up his own crime?
There's this big question about what did these people think they were doing? Did they think they were fooling everyone?
Right.
Did they think that they were actually somehow channeling? What did they think that they were doing?
In other words, they could have been in some kind of mystical trance, believing they were writing words that were revealed to them, or they could have just been saying, "Hey, this is what Enoch
would have said if he could have said it."
And that's a really big difference. In other words, and let me bring an example which I hope isn't offensive to you as an Orthodox Jew. But there are all these statements in the Talmud where, or in the Midrash especially, where it'll say, God in heaven said such and such. Did anybody really believe God said that? Or it was more like a homily,
Right, exactly. I actually had this experience. I was teaching a rabbinic story, a Talmudic story to a Christian group. And someone got very upset. And she said, "This is false prophecy. You're putting words in God's mouth." And I said, "This is a story. It's meant to convey an idea.
Right.
No one is thinking of it as putting words in God's mouth.
Right.
They're thinking of it as this is a way to convey a certain idea, because particularly in rabbinic literature, they don't write theological treatises the way, say, Paul did in the New Testament. If you want to convey a theological idea, the way you do it is through a story.
And so my favorite story is the oven of Achnai, which where God says at the end, "My sons have defeated me, my sons have defeated me." And what you're saying is the rabbis who wrote that story didn't literally believe God said, "My sons have defeted me," right? They were trying to convey a story. Am I understanding right?
They're trying to convey a certain idea. Now,
kind of convey a message.
You could say, now see, what a lot of people say, traditional people say, reading and saying, this actually happened. This isn't even just a story. This actually happened. Okay? And especially
but did God in heaven actually say that according to, let's say, ultra-Orthodox Jew believe?
Well, realize it says a heavenly voice comes out. They have the back.
No.
Right?
Okay. All right. No, but the continuation of the story is Rabbi Natan met Eliyahu. And he said, when that happened, what did God in heaven say?
Oh, right, yeah.
And Eliyahu responds, "Banai Tzchuni, my sons have defeated me." So do ultra-Orthodox Jews, for example, believe that Rabbi Natan really meant Eliyahu? I mean, I don't know.
I think so. I think a lot of
many Orthodox Jews would say, no.
No, it's a story,
He's just trying to convey a message.
Right.
That
this has been given over to...
And there's this great quote from Elie Wiesel, who's something to the effect, he says, he meets this rabbi who he knew as a child, and the rabbi says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I write these, and the rabbi doesn't know what fiction is. He's never heard of it. So he describes you, he says, "I write fictional books," and he says what that is, and he says, "So you write lies?" And Elie Wiesel says, "No." He says something, and I'm misquoting it. It's a great quote. I'll post it on the page. He says something to the effect of, "Not everything that happened is true, and many things that are true never happened." And I think we should end with that. And we're done to do another episode on the Book of Watchers, which is this first section of Enoch. But this is really, I think, the really interesting thing, that there were these 70 secret books that some Jews knew about, some Jews may have considered authoritative.
And maybe 70, maybe not. But there's this idea,
that might be a round number,
is what they call a typological number, right?
But there were a lot of books that weren't part of the standard Jewish Bible. And, when I think of, as Josephus talks about how there's these books that every Jew knows about, and nobody disputes them, he acts like he doesn't know about these 70 books. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but he overlooks them and kind of ignores them, maybe on purpose. This is an amazing discussion. We're going to continue this in the next part. And check out understandingsin.com by Dr. Miryam T. Brand. That's her podcast, her new website. And then on Amazon, we'll have a link to her book, Evil Within, Without, and the book where she wrote a 90-plus page chapter in, which is called Outside the Bible with a Commentary on Enoch.
Which is probably also in your library if you can. It's a 3-volume work.
Buy the book. All right. All right, shalom.
Shalom.
This episode of Hebrew Voices was sponsored by Adam from Colorado. Thank you. Todah.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.